If you have a Bible and you find it helpful to follow along, please turn in it to Psalm 119. This is where we'll be spending our time. One of the aspects of being a Christian, at least from my thinking, that makes it, I wouldn't call it difficult, but it does kind of disconnect it in some ways from what we see as we read our Bibles, is God's history is so long. And when we read a passage of Scripture relative to any kind of narrative, there can be years, decades that pass in just a paragraph or two. And so it makes it difficult. I remember speaking with somebody once, not a believer, who was talking about the fact that the Bible is just full of all these miracles happening all over the place all the time. Well, it's really not. It's not. You got to remember, that's 1,900 years of history up to Jesus. So the miraculous is interspersed in all of that. Not, even though you can take and read a Bible in a week or two of reading from cover to cover, that's not the way God has worked through history. And so when we read things from the Old Testament especially, and then compare them with the New, such as where Paul calls the law our schoolmaster, there's a gigantic raft of history that's connected to that. So it gives us questions as New Testament people to say, well, is the law there to be just scrupulously, circumspectly obeyed in detail? Or is the law something that's got another purpose? I think that we can discover the answer to that. So let's take a look at this text. Psalm 119, I'll begin reading in verse 1. How blessed are those whose actions are blameless, who obey the law of the Lord. How blessed are those who observe the Lord's rules and seek Him with all their heart, and who moreover do no wrong and follow in God's footsteps. You demand that your precepts would be carefully kept. If only I were predisposed to keep your statutes, then I would not be ashamed if I were focused on all your commands. I would give you thanks, sincere thanks, when I learn of all your regulations. I would keep your statutes. Do not completely abandon me. How can a young person maintain a pure life? By guarding it according to your instructions. With all my heart I seek you. Do not allow me to stray from your commands. In my heart I store up your words that I might not sin against you. You deserve praise, O Lord. Teach me your statutes. With my lips I proclaim all the regulations you've revealed. I rejoice in the lifestyle prescribed by your rules, as if they were riches of all kinds. The people who received these things throughout the history of the Jewish nation, for the most part, didn't really understand what they were receiving. They really didn't. I think if they had, things would have gone a lot different in the Jewish history than they did. But the people to whom these things came did understand. All the prophets who wrote understood. So they had a perspective of God's law that was very different than the people had as a perspective of God's law and the way it was supposed to operate. And then we move forward in time to the New Testament, and we see a very different perspective emerging once again. Now, for the Jew in the time in which these things were written, they started to see, as time went by, they saw the obedience to the law as a purely human enterprise, something that one would just see the regulations, obey the regulations. Their view, if you go back and read Deuteronomy chapter 6 through 8 and then 28 through 30, you see that there was as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, in the mind of the Jew, a quid pro quo. That is, you obey and things will go well, disobey, things are going to go poorly. I'm going to say, as a Christian today, there's nothing wrong in that. There's nothing wrong directly in that perspective. I mean, think about it. What if the entire world, from the time in which the Jewish nation emerged on the earth and God gave the law, had just attempted to live the law? What would the world look like if today, and through the history of this nation or the rest of the nations of the world, the world had attempted to obey just the 10 Commandments, I think the world would look very different than it does today. Very different. I think a lot of the difficulties that we face every day in this culture and all over the world, we would not face if everybody just attempted to obey the 10 Commandments. So it's not as though this is just an empty thing that God has placed this codified law in this nation, in the Jewish nation. Charles Haddon Spurgeon said, "Blessed is the one whose life is the transcript of God's will." I think there's something to that. I think there is. I mean, who could argue against it? How would you argue that it would not improve the world if everybody just obeyed only, or attempted, I leave it at attempted to obey the 10 Commandments? I think it would change everything. All of human government in the world today and throughout history, as far as I can tell, is predicated in many respects on a population that is virtuous. There is nothing about our nation, if we're to rule ourselves, which is the model that our nation has, it's predicated on a population that exhibits virtue as a whole. Otherwise, I think it was Thomas Jefferson who said, and John Adams said the same, that, and George Washington even said this, that if the population is not virtuous, this will fail. And I think we're seeing the results of that in our culture today. We're not virtuous, and it is failing in many respects. We're moving more and more and more toward a ruling class and everybody else. It's a lifetime's work. To me, I can't speak for anybody else here, to just take the 10 Commandments totally seriously in my life as a believer. It's a lifetime's work. And we can see how this weaves through everything that we are as human beings. Think of it like this. I was reading an article many years ago, and it was about a thief who had been caught. And in the interview where this journalist was talking to this thief, the thief made a strong point of making sure the journalist understood that the scruple for this particular thief was, I never ever rob from elderly people. Huh. Only other people, but not the elderly. In other words, this idea that there's something about a standard of morality is just built in, that no matter who we are, no matter where we are in life, you can see this in all kinds of arenas. Even in gangs, there are certain moral things that they all will adhere to and obey. So there's a connection, no matter what the culture, no matter where we are in this world, no matter what our surroundings, there is a connection between living in a moral way and having a decent life. And I just don't think we can deny that. We've talked about it here on Wednesday nights, but it's not necessarily something where God is then going to set us aside just because we've tried to live well. We saw that in Sunday school this morning. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Whether you burn us to death or God saves us, we're not going to bow down. So the psalmist seems to think that this is the way it works. That there's this connection between living well and obedience to the law. But it might be something that we don't quite capture as New Testament people. Yes, there is a connection, but that connection may not be that something that we would acquire as a practical thing. It might be something that just has to do with there's a peacefulness in just trying to live well. To look at God's law and say, I'm going to try to obey these things. There's a peace that comes with that, I think. But it's not always going to be the kind of thing where all the practical ramifications are exactly as we would see them to be. I think we kind of know that. And so when Jesus stands before people and says, follow the narrow way. Follow the narrow way. It's the way for life is narrow and few find it. The way to destruction is broad and most people go there. That's a really Jewish thing to say. It falls right back in line with exactly what we've read in this psalm this morning. If you were to take those words, think about it like this. What if you had read those words of Jesus regarding the narrow and the broad way and seen them in the Proverbs? They would make perfect sense. They'd be a perfect fit for the Proverbs, wouldn't they? They would fit right in. Let me read a text this morning. I think that sums some of this up better than I can. In the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 9, this is what the writer says. But now Christ has come as the high priest of good things to come. He passed through the greater and the more perfect tent, not made with hands, not of this creation. He entered once and for all into the most holy place, not by the blood of goats and calves and bulls, but by his own blood. And so he himself secured eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a young cow sprinkled on those who were defiled consecrated them and provided ritual purity, how much more would the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our consciences from dead works to the worship of the living God? Here's where the psalmist's writings intersect where you and I live as New Testament believers. The demand to obey versus the lack of the ability to obey. The psalmist says it so well. Look at the text in the psalm. If only I were predisposed to obey your law. That, for me, you could take the whole of the Old Testament and sum it up in that one phrase. There was ritual cleansing available in the Old Testament, but not a cleansing of the conscience. That's the distinction that the letter to the Hebrews makes, is that our conscience can be cleansed, and it's not just for that moment. It's an eternal cleansing. Whereas in the Old Testament, they had sacrifices twice a day, every day. They kept a whole herd of sheep out there just for the daily sacrifices twice a day. And then on Yom Kippur, they did even more of that for the Day of Atonement. But it didn't last. You could come into the temple totally corrupt, go before the priest, go and engage the sacrifice, have all the oblations and the various things done, such that you would then leave the temple ritually clean. But only ritually clean. Nothing had changed in the person. That was always the limit. The psalmist is getting to the heart of it. If only I were predisposed to do the right thing. That would change everything, wouldn't it? You read about in Numbers 19, there's the whole ritual that's alluded to in this text in Hebrews. It's called the ritual of the red heifer. And back when the temple was a tabernacle and they moved it about, what they would do is if you were ritually, ceremonially unclean, and of course to be ceremonially unclean as a Jew was terrible, because if you touched another Jew, they were ceremonially unclean. And so there was this, you were almost isolated from the population by being unclean, just like the leper. So what would they do? You'd come before the priest, they would take a red heifer outside the camp, sacrifice it. They would take the blood and go sprinkle it back toward the tabernacle 7 times, a very ordered thing that had to be done. Then they would burn the carcass, and then after burning, they would take the ashes, and the ashes would be applied, and the ashes would make you then ceremonially clean. Very complicated. You had to burn it with certain things. You had to use cedar wood, hyssop, and you had to incorporate a piece of red cloth in the ceremony, in the fire. And all of these things purified one, but just for that moment. Didn't change the heart at all. Think about it in our day. What do we do? If you want to buy a house, what do you have to do? You have to sign all kinds of papers. I remember sitting there at the table when we bought our first house. I didn't have a clue what I was signing. There'd be 10 sheets of paper, and then there'd be an X with a little sticky thing there to say, here's where you and Becky have to sign this piece of paper. 10 pages of little itty bitty writing, all explaining all the things we were responsible for. I didn't understand any of it. Why did we have to do that? Because we're not predisposed to do the right thing. That's why. We have contracts because we're not predisposed to do the right thing. And this all flows back to exactly what David says in this psalm. If only I were predisposed. Well, Jesus came and he fulfilled the entirety of the ceremonial law and the civil law and the moral law. All summed up in one person's life, death, and resurrection. Every bit of it. And the moral law still stands. Even though he fulfilled it. You read your New Testament and tell me there's not a moral law. I don't know how anybody can read the Sermon on the Mount and come away from it feeling good. I don't. I read the Sermon on the Mount and come away from it and think, wow, have I ever got a long way to go before I'm even close to who it is God would call me to be. The temporal sacrifices, they were there, and they were, as Paul says, that's why Paul says the law was our schoolmaster. It's there to show us, to teach us what sin looks like in front of a holy God. Those are words I can't even capture in my own thinking. I can say them. It's to teach us what sins look like to a holy God. But I can't feel that. I have no idea what that means, really, other than just the concept. I can't feel it. I can't capture it because I'm not holy. So it makes no, I have to just accept it as a statement. The person who came to the priest could be completely corrupt. They could be ceremonially made clean, and they leave there just as corrupt as they came in. The only difference is they've obeyed, and so they've gotten some credit with God on the basis of that obedience. And that's all. And just for them. What about the next day? You're going to show up at the temple every day, twice a day for the entirety of your life for sacrifices? I don't see how you'd have an alternative, really. Think about Jesus and what he did. Just think about, we live in it now, and so we just accept it. We live with all the benefit of what Jesus has accomplished. We don't realize, I don't, what it really means. We can stand before God, which the Jew, they couldn't do that. Nobody stood before God in the Jewish understanding except the high priest once a year, or the priests who were offering the daily sacrifices in the temple. The Jews had them to stand before God for them. That's part of being a schoolmaster. It's teaching us something here. The fact that you and I, as the Scripture says, can simply boldly approach the throne of God without any mediator because of what Jesus has done. See, Jesus' sacrifice, as the text to the Hebrews says, makes us clean of conscience. That's the inside. Think about the distinction between Jesus' sacrifice and the animal sacrifice. All right, the animal had its life taken from it. There's no connection there with that animal. It doesn't have a clue what's going on. Jesus, on the other hand, offered his life. He offered it up. The sacrifice was dictated by the Jewish ritual system. But Jesus, his sacrifice was a spontaneous one out of love. Very different. Jesus' sacrifice was rational. He knew what he was doing. Those animals don't have any idea what's going on. They're walking around in the herd. Everything's going well. All of a sudden somebody grabs the animal, carries it into the temple. The animal's afraid. The animal doesn't know what's happening. The animal then standing there, the priest is doing things. The animal doesn't have any connection to what's going on. It doesn't understand any of it. The next thing it knows, its throat is cut and it's bleeding out. That's the whole animal's connection to all of that. Jesus knew exactly what he was here for and what he was going to do. His decision to make the sacrifice was a moral one on your behalf and on mine. I'll tell you, we have visited them, and you all know this to be true. There are lots of people who say, I believe in Jesus for the sacrifice for my sins, who believe that efforts to live a good life will gain them credit with God. That is just, I I don't know how to express it. If only we could empty ourselves of that notion. I don't know how we can do it. We can't live in any way that's going to gain us credit with God at all. Jesus is the credit. What he did on the cross is the credit. So when we come to the point of saying, I want to live for the Lord, it's not out of gaining credit. It's just gratitude for what he's already done that I didn't have anything to do with. I just look up and I say, I want that. What you're offering on my behalf, I will take in faith. That's all I can do. There are so many people who do not ever come to the kingdom of God to be born again because they are convinced that they have to do something in and of themselves in order to gain that credit with God. And they'll be lost forever on that basis. Imagine. Imagine what it would be like to think oneself living in a way, and I promise you there are people that think this way, good people, living in such a way. I had somebody, an intimate friend, say this to me in the last few months, listing off all the good things they've done, and then saying to me after they made the list, I think God will have me on the basis of what I've done. You know, there was a plane that was flying. I don't know much if you know much about aircraft. They're very interesting. I didn't know this until I'd read an article about it a while back. And when the pilot and co-pilot want to set their course, especially in regions not only for air traffic but for topography, where they're in mountainous areas of the world, like in the Andes, very high mountains. A lot of the planes that fly at lower altitudes, they have to plot their course relative to the mountain range. And the courses are set via names. I didn't know this. I didn't know how they did it. But there are names where it'll be like Roger 18 or whatever. And they type that name into the flight computer and it plots the course. That's all they have to do. And then they just have to make minor adjustments to wind, and then when the towers contact them about other planes in the air and that sort of thing. Well, this pilot that's flying in the Andes put the course name in. It was very similar to another course name. And just by the virtue of a human error, which we all make, how many times have you and I thought something said X when really it didn't say that, and we'd just gone through years of life thinking this is what this was, and we were wrong about it. He put in the wrong title, very similar to the other title, and that plane just climbed up into the air and dutifully flew into the side of a mountain and killed everybody. That's what thinking that you and I can earn our way to God's credit is like. It's like putting the wrong thing in the flight computer and flying the whole course and then crashing into the mountain at the end. Because we've, as one writer said, we've had our ladder propped up on the wrong wall the whole time. The law, all the law does is show us our need for Jesus. That's all it does now. It shows us our need for Him. We have to be cleansed of conscience by the sacrifice that was made once and for all. And there's no other way. I don't know where everybody is today, but if anything I've said, you've got a question for me, you want to pray with me, I'll stay here as long as it takes as we close.